Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin the next presentation. Sorry, we're a couple of minutes behind, so if you will. Thank you. So, good morning again. Thank you for being here for Max's presentation, and now I will attempt to do something unique and new. Every year I try to bring some bit of academia here, whether it's discussing how much black or white there is in ragtime, or who drew what covers, or it was something. At least this year I decided, no, I'm just going to have fun. So we're going to talk about ragtime figures, and we're going to do it a little bit of a gossipy way. So if you will, this is going to be informal and fun, and you can make comments during it if you want. So if we will, we're going to do this my style, and something you've not seen. Oh, yeah, there. I decided to be my evil twin this year with a little... It's going away on Sunday, I'll tell you. Hard to maintain, yes. Oh, did I hear a oh? It's my face. So, anyway, we're going to do this new television style. So, and we're going into a new place, the Ragtime Zone. I just made up that theme, so. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to talk about some of the notorious people of ragtime that actually were new. These songs ripped from the headlines, real people, real events, real ragtime, and story and song. I don't know who the guy who does that voice on TV, but it's great. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ragtime Zone. I like drama, so, okay. So first we're going to talk about, what are we talking about first? The train wreck. Now I did this last year, but I'm going to go briefly through it. The big train wreck. The Scott Joplin train wreck. We're going to talk about why was this a real thing, the Great Crush Collision. It sounds like a collision in which trains were crushed. Well, that's not exactly true. Joplin was taking, possibly, because it was a widely known example by that time, example of E.T. Paul, who written the chariot race, the Ben-Hur March, in 1893, had it published in 1894, and it went across the country. It was a descriptive march in which there's actually musical descriptions in there, more so, I think, for the sake of the pianist than the listener, but to say, oh, yes, and they're going down the stretch, and Masala has taken on Ben-Hur, and Ben-Hur's wheels are cut, and it's a lot of stuff in there. Here's another one he wrote a year later. There was already a charge of the Light Brigade written before that, but E.T. Paul thought his was a little more descriptive. So we don't know for sure, but perhaps Joplin caught wind of this, says, I can do something like that. And there's the charge, the cavalry call. You've heard those bugle calls, so he puts that in there. So let's go to Crush, Texas. Where the heck is that? It's just north of Waco. It does not exist. It did exist for a day. Population was over 40,000 people. One day. And that's where William George Crush, who was an agent for the Katy line, and of course the Daily is a big part of the Katy line, decided something. He said, we're going to make some revenue. People love coming to train wrecks. As grisly, as gruesome as that is, they love to see these beasts on their side or exploded. Why don't we charge for them to watch one? So they spent several months doing this in 1896, getting ready for it, setting up a place, building special sighting tracks for it, getting the advertising out. The event was free. You could come for free. The only way to get there was on a train. You had to buy a ticket, but so what? So the day of the event comes in September 1896, and they had 2 locomotives. I did not colorize this. I should have, but one was painted red, one was painted green. They touched noses. It was a big festivity. You can see some of the people in the background. These were taken by Jarvis Dean, also known as Joe Dean, at least before this event. And he was the official photographer for the thing. He was brave. So you can see the sighting track. Locomotives touched noses. Then they backed off and ran at each other from 2 miles off each at a rate of, I guess they eventually got to 60 miles an hour, and they collided. And that's the explosion taken by Jarvis Dean. A moment later, he became known as One-Eyed Jarvis Dean. Because they did not anticipate this. They didn't think, I love this crayon thing. They didn't think that they was going to explode. They said, no, we've got it all figured out. It's not going to explode. The boilers exploded. Bolts went everywhere. 2 people were killed. About 40 were injured. It was quite a calamity. Well, here's some of the aftermath, as you can see. All the curious onlookers, where are the dead people, is what they're looking for, because that's how we do this now. William George Crush was almost immediately summarily fired for doing such a hazardous thing. But then, about 2 days later, they were adding up the receipts and said, get this guy back. And they didn't publicize that they rehired him. So anyhow, he had a nice long career with Acadie, went into the 1920s. Was Scott Joplin there? We don't know. Did he know about this? Everybody knew about this event if you lived in Texas or Missouri or any of that. So he wrote this commemorative march, which was published, I think, in November. And look where it was published. It was in Temple, Texas, which is it's where the publisher was doing his works at the time. Is very near where Crush was. And it sort of exists. So anyway, he decides to do this descriptive thing. Let's see. Here it is. A musical collision. So, he was writing about a real event. This is important to know. I didn't know this growing up. I got the big Scott Joplin book when I was 11 years old back in, I think, 70 or so, something like that. Oh, no, I mean 1990. Anyway, this still exists. You can go see this plaque at the side of the road. I don't know which road it is, and a big deal about it, So much for Crush. Now our next topic. Going to get into the grisly murder in St. Louis. You know this song. You know what that is. Frankie and Johnny, you think. You're going to find out. Maybe it's not so much. That is Frankie Baker. Oh, she was awful. And that is Al Britt. Alfred Britt, but some people think he was Albert because of the name Al Britt. Well, in 1896, it was a busy year. She ended up, she was, I think, 22 years old. He was 17. They got into a lover's tiff. She was a worker, shall we say. She knew how to work things, meaning men. So I don't want to get too graphic in that. So they had a little argument, and he crossed her, and he went off with some other girl or something. She worked, but she was not one of those type of workers. I think the lady he went off with was one of those type of workers. Anyhow, she did not like it, Frankie Baker. So what do you think she did? She stabbed Al, and there was blood and ooze everywhere. So I had to pay extra for this, Okay. You like that effect? That was hard. Okay. And she was summarily arrested, spent a few nights in prison, and at the trial, she was exonerated. Al, of course, was dead. Didn't matter, but she decided after a while to leave St. Louis. Frankie Baker was real. So this was in 1896, it became, or 1897 or so, became a popular ballad with a different melody, which was going around St. Louis. So the story of Frankie and Albert. Well, somehow Johnny is in a lot of songs. You got John. Johnny Comes Marching Home Again, and George M. Cohan later. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. And of course, which is Row, 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 Johnny is in there. Johnny was a very popular name in song, so somehow Albert got changed to Johnny. So enough of the oohs there. So Frankie decided to escape St. Louis and ended up going up to Omaha for a while in Nebraska. I found her there in the 1910 census, and she was working as a housekeeper. So anyway, Frankie and Johnny, Leighton Brothers and Wren Shields, a lot of this was stolen, which you're going to find out pretty soon. Here's 2 editions of this thing, printed in 1912 and 1915, respectively. Taylor, I forget the other music publisher there. These were very popular ballads, but they already existed, and some of the verses were lifted from other things. And eventually, of course, it was made into movies, silent films and sound films alike. Well, Frankie ended up in Portland, Oregon, for the last years of her lives. And people thought she was a nut job because she said, I'm the one, I'm the Frankie in that song. So when a 1935 film came out, she tried to sue the studio, say, you can't just put my life story up there on the screen like that. So she got mad at Hollywood. But supposedly it was racism, possibly it was racism, that her case was dismissed. The judge did not like it. Look how sad this is. When she ended up dying, she was senile and insane. Maybe she wasn't. They just thought she was because of that story. And just spent the rest of her life having to deal with she shot her man, even though it was with a knife. So go figure. So that's the sad story of Frankie and Johnny. But how about another sad story? On one summer day, the sun was shining fine. The lady love, old Bill Bailey, was hanging clothes on the line in her backyard, and weeping hard. She married a B&O, Baltimore and Ohio brakeman, who went and throwed her down, bellowing like a prune-fed cat with a big gang hanging around. And to that crowd, she yelled out loud, you know this part, won't you come home, Bill Bailey, won't you come home? You can go all night long. I'll do the cooking, honey, I'll pay the rent. I know I done you wrong. Remember that rainy eve that I throwed you out with nothing but a fine-tooth comb? Know that I'm to blame, well now, ain't that a shame? Bill Bailey, won't you please come home? Wouldn't you hate to be Mrs. Bailey and try to make a confession like that? So, before we talk about Bill Bailey, let's talk about his alleged originator. He's a sad case. This guy is Huey Cannon. Hugo was his birth name. He was born into a vaudeville family, more or less. His mother already had left the dad, or the dad left the mother by the time he was born. So he ended up growing up with 2 stepfathers and was pushed onto the stage at 10. Well, one of the things he learned about in his early teens was the joys of alcohol. and later of drugs. So he was more or less an addict from age 15 to the end of his not quite long enough life. But he also was very musical and came up with Bill Bailey, Won't You Please Come Home in 1902. So Mr. Cannon, who ended up dying of cirrhosis and all kinds of things in 1910, would write a brilliant song like this. He had quite a few. Here's another one. Well, this is the original. We're going to get to that in a minute. But he would write a song like Bill Bailey, and he wanted the money because he wanted to drink. And he took it to Holly Haviland, and they would publish it and give him $50. He says, do you want a royalty? He says, no, I need the money now. I can't wait for it. $50 for Bill Bailey. How much money has that made with so many artists who have done this? Anyhow, did Bill Bailey exist already? He did. This song is from 1901, written by a friend of Huey Cannon. They worked in the same vaudeville theater at times. Walter Wilson, John Queen. Walter Wilson was his friend. And this, ain't that a shame, and you're to blame. Ain't that a shame, which is also mentioned in the Bill Bailey song. And Bill Bailey's name is in Ain't That a Shame. We don't know if it's the same Bill Bailey that they're referring to, but Huey Cannon did not make up Bill Bailey. And hopefully neither did Walter Wilson. We'll get to that. Here's some other Bill Bailey songs. I wonder why Bill Bailey won't come home. Did he? Since Bill Bailey came back home. These aren't even written by Cannon. Here's another one. When old Bill Bailey plays the ukulele. That's from the 1910s. Oh, here's a good one. Huey Cannon got tired of hearing Bill Bailey knockoffs. I think there were 5 or 6. So he wrote The Death of Bill Bailey. Figure, I'll kill him off. Nobody else can write about him. Wrong. All right. So listen to the melody from He Done Me Wrong, Death of Bill Bailey. Sound familiar? That's from 1904. So the Leighton brothers, who also, they stole all kinds of stuff. No, they didn't. They appropriated. Okay. Leighton brothers did some popular songs, including, I can't think of them all, but that was a big deal. They stole this one also. And then they repurposed it as their version of Frankie and Johnny. So it's ironic. Huey Cannon wrote the basis for Frankie and Johnny, but did he? I mean, it may have been an existing melody at that point, for all we know. What's interesting is someone will catch on. 1904, and the verse of Bill Bailey is almost the same, and the verse of Ain't That a Shame. It's blues. This is long before the Dallas blues or Baby Seals blues, which are supposedly the original blues. Even Oh You Beautiful Gal has a blues verse. So the blues in printed form existed, and this is a great example here. Well, Bill Bailey did not die. And in fact, Bill Bailey wrote a piece, The Ragtime Caveman, from 1922. I wonder why it didn't do very well. Well, actually, I looked through the piece. I know why it didn't do very well. So, okay. So this was allegedly written by the real Bill Bailey, who was a musician. So who was he? This guy, Willard Bailey of Jackson, Michigan. And Huey Cannon also was based in Jackson, Michigan. He went to New York and Detroit quite a few times. So this is the scoundrel right here. Now, we don't know if the original Ain't That a Shame by Walter Wilson is based on him or not, or John Queen, who knew him. Both knew him. But he was an entertainer and a bit of a scoundrel, and his wife knew that. So while they were in Jackson, Huey thought, I'll write another song, and I'll write one about you. And he wrote that verse that I sang just now, and the whole thing. He said, oh, this is fun, this is clever. It's about a black brakeman, but it's also about me. So he took it home to his wife, Mildred, you see right there. She was not amused. I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, she was ready to throw him out right there. Took another 5 years before she finally did. Same way, the song becomes a big hit, and now she's in Frankie Baker's people. She's said, I am not a human carpet. It doesn't matter what that song says. I am not a doormat. Here she is at an old age. She got the jump on Bill Bailey. He moved to Los Angeles and later up to somewhere in Washington, but he was a performer, and he wrote that one piece. I couldn't find anything else by him. But the copyright confirms it's the same Willard Bailey, who was pianist and banjoist. So Mildred Bailey lived to be 100 years old, and to her dying day, she could not get rid of the stigma of Bill Bailey. So, sad story. The real Bill Bailey. Casey Jones. I have Casey Jones. You know this one. Come all you rounders if you wanna hear the story about a brave engineer. Casey Jones was the rounder's name. On a 6/8 wheeler he won his fame. And then we have the chorus. I don't know the song very well. Casey Jones mounted to the cabin. Casey Jones, orders in his hand. Casey Jones mounted to the cabin, and he took a farewell train to the promised land. All right, so he was real. Casey Jones was real. Was he a hero? Let's look at that. Let's look at that. There we go. All right, so here's copy in hand right here. I got the song that came out, very popular song, Southern California Music Company, so far from where he was. So that's the real Casey Jones mounted in his cabin. That is the locomotive he became famous for. He actually started out some years before in Illinois and ended up down Kentucky line going down to New Orleans, based largely in Louisville. So chug on out of there. Then there was the night of the fatal accident, which made it into this ballad. And boring a little bit, the accident occurred. He essentially was coming down the hill. He was late. He was trying to make up time. There was a freight there, and they were trying to get out of his way as well. They just didn't do it in time. So he knew he could see the smoke up ahead, and he knew that things were going to happen. He blew the whistle so that the firemen and a couple other people could get out of the way, and of course those on the train that he was heading had. So he's considered a hero because he pulled a cord, but he stayed on the train. But he was already speeding. He was going 50, 60 miles an hour at the time of the accident. So he was reckless. Time was more important than lives. Well, that's not absolutely true. But Casey Jones ended up dying in this train wreck. And then they thought, how clever. Let's write a ballad for him. About 6 years later, this ballad comes out. Now, this is about a real guy and a real event. So instead to have him heading towards San Francisco, the opposite coast of where he was, and you think, this is the tragic event. He's going to the promised land. But listen to this last verse. Let's see. Casey said just before he died, there's 2 more roads that I'd like to ride. Fireman said, what could that be? He said the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe. Ugh. Mrs. Jones sat on her bed, sighing. Just received a message that Casey was dying. Oh my. Said, go to bed, children, and hush your crying, because you got another papa on the Salt Lake line. How cruel. Needless to say, Mrs. Jones was not amused. Said what they did with her husband. So, another tragedy from the ragtime zone. And Disney made a cartoon out of it, and they based it on this song, but he ended up not dying in the cartoon. He was a hero because he saved everything, stopped the train in time. Can't anybody tell the truth? Nobody. Somebody dies in every Disney film, but it's not usually the hero. So, no, that's true. Look it up sometime. So now there's a monument to him, and here he is, a beautiful painting, 1900 when he died. So, daring and romance. Well, let's go to something else a little more real. I wish I had that voice to do that. Robert E. Lee, pleasure, boat, or death trap. Watch them shuffling along, hear them shuffling along, and you know that song, the Robert E. Lee. Well, in 1912, when this was written, if you were waiting for it, you'd be waiting a long time, which we'll get into. Here's the song, and the story allegedly is Gilbert had written something unkind in the papers because he was a newspaper writer about Muir. So they had a little, said, well, what have you written? And Gilbert says, well, this and this is, yeah, well, I've written hits. So like Ragtime Cowboy Joe, things like that, that were actual hits. Well, why don't we write something together? So they sat down and they wrote some ballad and they wrote this thing. And the next day, they took it to Frederick Mills, the publisher, and they played the ballad. And he said, yeah, it's lovely, it's not quite what we're doing, but maybe we'll buy it, we'll figure it. And then, sat down, Muir went down. He said, Dixie songs are passé. Not interested. It's a pass. Well, Muir was furious. So he just stormed out of the office, and Gilbert was following him out of the office. He got down to the street, and he was really mad. He said, damn, I forgot the score. I got to go back and get the score, because they didn't have copy machines back then. So they had to get their originals. He comes back into the office, and Mills is saying, I can't get that melody out of my head. I'm hearing it over and over and over. And so he ended up buying the song, and it was a big hit. But what was it based on? Was there a Robert E. Lee? Yes, there was one of legend. He's the first guy to sing it on film. I'm trying to think of the actor's name. It wasn't Al Jolson who first sang this in The Jazz Singer. It was the guy playing young Jakey Rabinowitz. I have that written somewhere. Don't have my computer with me. This guy also wrote a song. Called the Robert E. Lee, because he wanted, when he made The Jazz Singer, that's Neil Diamond, of course, on the right. When he made his own version of The Jazz Singer, he wanted to pay some homage to the original. So that's why he wrote a Robert E. Lee song, which was a big hit, never. So what is the Robert E. Lee? There is a drawing of the Robert E. Lee as it existed in the 1860s, just before the Civil War. And it was a very fast steamboat, and it generally was on the Mississippi. I think we have a better picture here, a nicer painting of it in the 1870s. Well, there was a famous race, and it's actually mentioned a little bit in the song Down Yonder, which was later written by L. Wolfe Gilbert, about this race between the Robert E. Lee and the other supposed fastest boat on the Mississippi, the Natchez. Well, the Robert E. Lee made it from New Orleans to St. Louis less than 4 days. It won the race handily. It's like doing the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs or something like that. I have no idea. I think there's another. This is an actual photograph taken in 1875 of the Robert E. Lee, just before it burned up. So if you were waiting for the Robert, a beautiful model kit you can buy. If you're waiting for the Robert E. Lee in 1912 when the song was written, you're still waiting, because they never rebuilt it. But the Robert E. Lee was real. So, anyone know who this guy is? Okay, and he's responsible for. Well, let's go back to this. Right, they have the grizzly bear, of course, is a great. The George Botsford rag. Grizzly bear. When this originated, early 20th century, late 19th century, people thought of bears as scary. Bears aren't cuddly. They kill you. The Revenant hadn't even made yet, and yet they knew what would happen if you get too close to a bear. This guy changed it. This, of course, Theodore Roosevelt, who made it to the presidency of the United States because nobody wanted him where he was. He became the police commissioner of New York. And I said, no, I'm trying to dig the dirt up here. I said, no, he was trying to clean up corruption. And you know who didn't like that? The police. They did not like that he was cleaning up corruption. So finally, they say, well, what can we do? Where can we put him? I said, we'll make him the governor of New York. So. And then he created waves, so they said, we'll make him Secretary of the Navy. What can he do there? Then he goes to San Juan Hill and becomes triumphant and says, we're going to put him in a position where there is nothing he can do, no power whatsoever. So he became the Vice President of the United States. Sadly, McKinley was shot 8 months into his term, and Teddy Roosevelt became a highly effective bully president. Here he is in the 1880s when he's learning to be a rugged mountain man. He was a weakly child and decided, I've got to build myself up. Went out west and spent some time in buckskin. People ridiculed him, but later in life they did not. Here he is, of course, as Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, the mountain man. And here he is. You talk about the bully pulpit. That's it, the bull moose pulpit, right? I know, it's just that's an awesome picture. That's power right there. So, how did we get the teddy bear? Well, he actually is responsible for it. Clifford Berryman drew this cartoon in 1902. Roosevelt was trying to get a section of the line between Alabama and Mississippi. So they were trying to figure out where the state line was. They said, well, we'll call in the president of all people to arbitrate this, where he thinks the state line should be. And said, while we're here, we know he likes to hunt, so we're going to do a hunting expedition. Well, they spent the whole day trying to look for a bear, because there was an advance team. I guess they just set up the bear. Said, okay, you stand over there, the president will come shoot you. Well, they couldn't find but a little bear cub. They didn't even know where the mom was. So they tied the thing up to a tree. And Roosevelt comes and says, you want me to do what? So he refused to, and this story immediately hit the press. He would not shoot that bear. Well, of course, this is the original cartoon. The bear there is kind of big, probably bigger than it actually was. As Berryman redrew this cartoon several times, he made the bear smaller and smaller and cuter. Well, by the end of the year in 1902, somebody got an idea, wow, this could sell. We're going to make it Teddy's Bear. And a guy in New York, who eventually would form the Ideal Toy Company, created this. And this is actually one of the original bears from I think this was from 1904, but it's been around for a while. It's in the Smithsonian. Isn't he cute? Bears weren't cute, yet he was. And about the same time, we don't know who was first, the Stief Bear Company in Germany also made their version up. There's some subtle differences. This is a big seller at Christmas 1902. And by 1905, the teddy bear was a part of American culture. And it was named after Teddy Roosevelt. That's awesome. So, of course, the next thing, you have music comes up. So here's a cute one. That was, I think, the first teddy bear piece. Teddy bear pieces, this is for little kids to do. Here's a teddy bear's lullaby. Obviously, mostly oriented toward kids. Anna Held, Mrs. Ziegfeld at the time, did her own teddy bear. Would you be my teddy bear? So everybody's just trying to get in on that. She left me for a teddy bear. I didn't even crack that one open. I said, no, not even worth it. Teddy Bear Blues, that's from the 1920s, or no, 1910s, but it was a pretty cool piece. But we all know what the big one was. Teddy Bear's Picnic, written as a little march in 1907 by John Bratton. This exploded. It was so big. In the 1920s, late 1920s, lyrics were added, which is why the version with lyrics is still under copyright. But if you don't sing while I play it, no one's going to come after us, which is pretty good. And it became a theme for several radio shows for kids I've heard on TV. So Teddy Roosevelt was responsible for all of these. Wake up. There we go. So, as long as we're on the Roosevelts, the dress was really blue or gold or Yanny. I don't know. What does that mean? Well, Teddy had several children. He had a daughter. Now, her name was Alice, but he couldn't refer to her by that name because I think it was like a day or 2 days after she was born, he lost his mother and he lost his wife, also named Alice, same day. You talk about tragedy. That's why he went out west. So she was raised for a couple of years, at least by aunts, and once Teddy got remarried, he had Alice back in. He had a nickname for her, but because he just could not call her Alice. It was just too hard on his heart. Well, she was her father's daughter. She was a very independent lady. She liked to smoke and drink and swear and all those things. And at one point, when she was making the news in 1912, or 1907 rather, while he was still president, said, "Mr. Roosevelt, can't you control your daughter?" Because she was just out making messes. "I can run the United States of America. I can control my daughter, but I can't do both at the same time." Well, anyway, she had, you see this beautiful, this is a colorized picture that I found of this gold, maybe it's not a gold dress, I don't know. Anyway, she showed up at a ball in Washington with a dress that they ended up, it's iceberg blue is what they call it, but then they ended up calling it Alice, oh, there you go, Alice Blue. This was Alice's blue gown, Alice Roosevelt. And of course, a song was inevitable. You like that? I know some tricks. Okay. And this came out in the 1910s from Irene, and it became a big hit once it was in the films many years later. But Alice Blue is an official color. Is teal, for instance, or whatever you know. It used to be flesh in the crayon box. It's now peach or something. Anyhow, she married this guy, Nicholas Longworth, who was also a politician. But by all accounts, he was a little bit skinky and a little bit weaselly. Well, she didn't care for him very much. She just married him for the prestige and ended up having several affairs. And one of those affairs resulted in her child. And I guess nobody could do much about it. So it was widely known. That wasn't, anyway, here she is on the carrier Theodore Roosevelt, which is still around. She lived into the 1970s. And it has, as part of its color palette, Alice Blue. all over it. So Alice Blue Gown is based on Alice Roosevelt. And boy, she was feisty. She was part of the women's movement and advocated for things. So Hiawatha. We're going to talk about Hiawatha. Not so Native American after all. What do we know about Hiawatha? Well, that's essentially what you think. Hiawatha. It was a long, 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 Longfellow poem. And here you are, the Song of Hiawatha, a couple of editions. He just wrote this epic thing about a Native American back then. I guess it was Indian that they call. We're trying to be politically correct here. No tweeting, by the way. So today, here he is, Mr. Longfellow. Well, that resulted, or did it, in these pieces. I have a couple of these editions here of Hiawatha. It is not a song about Indians. It was not intended as that. When lyrics were added, it became that. Listen to this. This is from the opening. Well, let's see. Here we are. I haven't done this for a while. You hear that rhythm? Well, the composer, it says Neil Murray, it was actually Charles N. Daniels who was responsible for getting Joplin's original rags into print. One day in 1901 was taking a train ride. That's the rhythm of the train in there. And that persists, it got into his head. So he came up with this melody for Hiawatha. And it was published, it was about the city of our town or whatever, of Hiawatha. There's Charles Daniels, and this was the cause of Hiawatha right there. And this is a locomotive from that same line that went from Kansas City up to Hiawatha, which is, of course, in northeast Kansas, more or less, toward the center of the state. Why he was going there doesn't matter. He was inspired to write this tune, but because the town shared the same name with the Native American poem, it became a song about Indians, and everybody started writing that type of music. Even Joseph Lamb wrote a little piece that I helped several years ago with Muskoka Falls, which was essentially an Indian piece. So many of them came out. We're going to go over another one in a minute. There is Hiawatha, Kansas. Okay, any questions? Marty, I don't see Hamburg on there. Where is it? It's north of St. Joe a little bit there, I know. Okay, so that's quite a train ride there. Had time to think about it. Here's Hiawatha, Kansas. Beautiful place, and the train station that he pulled into. Another view of the same train station several years later. I don't know if that's there anymore. This is just another town in Kansas. I don't think there's anything suspect or Native American about it. But a pretty place if you ever want to visit. However, he may have had some association with this band. Back then, every town of any size had a band. Sometimes some companies had their own band because music was a big activity. We didn't have iTunes or radio or anything back then. All you had was your own music. So these were the heroes of the town. So, Princess Redwing never made boots. That's the other Native American. You know this part. So we know that piece, Red Wing. Well, There's a beautiful Indian maiden on the cover. Was she just contrived? Was she made up? There's that cover. There's a later version of that cover. It first came out, again, just like with Hiawatha, as an intermezzo. It was just a little piece, and the words were later added by Thurland Chataway. There have been, I think, 2 sets of lyrics added since, even. Indian fable, Indian intermezzo. So there's a difference. So who was Redwing? Well, there's this lovely lady, this picture taken in the 1960s, who was actually an East Coast advocate for several tribes. She was born into it. She lived in New York and was called in on several tribal councils and did negotiation with the United States government. So she'd be a great candidate for Red Wing, except that she was 6 years old when the piece came out, so maybe not. But there is this actress right here who was a big ham. I watched a couple of her films, and she was just trying to be, yes, I'm big Indian actress or something. I think her voice was higher or something like that. And she was born in 1893. She would be roughly, 16, 17 when this song came out. And possibly someone heard her name, and that's where Carrie Mills came up with it. He was in New York, and at the time she was in New York because that's where films were being made. It was long before Hollywood, actually. So possibly, since she was working for the New York Motion Picture Company, thought, well, that's a pretty cool name. Wrote it. We don't know because her first film did not come out until 1908, a year after Red Wing, or maybe at least several months. But could have been known to her. I couldn't find anything on stage, but she's the most likely candidate to be the real Red Wing. At least she claims so, almost as soon as the tune came out. There she is with her husband, acting in some of these films, did quite a few westerns, and get out of the way, there we go. There's the posse right there. So yes, Red Wing was around, but how much Indian, we don't know. I think 50%, she was an actress, she was a ham. So now you know something more about Red Wing. Now, multiple claimants of 12th Street. You know this one. Wow, it's been a while since I've done 12th Street, and we usually hear it fast. 12th Street rag, famous rag. Where is 12th Street? Well, let's talk about the guy who composed it first. His name is Uday Bowman. Here's a later edition of 12th Street rag, but that's not the original cover. This was a piece written ostensibly between 1908 and 1914 when it was finally written down by this guy, Uday Lewis Bowman. Here's an original cover. I was fortunate enough to get this. My wife found it on a little trip when she went into an antique store. And this is actually his imprint. It's not some of the later copies you see, and it's got a hand-stamped copyright, and it's really cool. So I've seen this edition. And the clue, actually, as to where this is on the cover, because that's not just a random drawing. That is a real place. And that place is Kansas City. 12th Street, Kansas City. We actually have more proof of that as I go along, because there were 3 different covers that were done by the same artist, all on Kansas City, which is odd because Bowman was based in Fort Worth. But he went back and forth a lot. He liked Kansas City, and I don't know, the rumor was around that 12th Street was the red light district. In Fort Worth it was. In Kansas City it was the business district, and it still to some extent is. And here's another view of Kansas City. This is about 1912, so a few years after the song, or before the song. The 11th Street rag. If you look there in the back, you see Woolworth. Now, in the middle of that, that's supposedly Maud Gilmore. If you were here at a concert last night, you would have heard, or afternoon, I guess, you would have heard a piece by Maud Gilmore that she wrote. So Maud Gilmore played at that Woolworths for several years, and they knew her. So there you have some proof, but if you look at the actual building, there you are, Kansas City. That's the 12th Street. So it's not just any 12th Street. I know everybody has a 12th Street in their hometown, and there's that Woolworth Company. At the time when it was built, it was the largest in the world. It was a pretty big 4-floor, 5 and 10 cent store. Here's another one, Petticoat Lane. Petticoat Lane is also, these are all within 3 blocks of each other. It's part of the business district. And actually, if we go back and look at this view right here, this view right here, this is 11th Street seen from Petticoat Lane. And Petticoat Lane was called so because there were a couple of garment manufacturers there, but also dental offices. So for some reason, if you wanted dentures, you went to where the petticoats were. And it was only 2 blocks long. That's the whole extent of it. So why he wrote a piece for that, we don't know. Some scandal must be involved. I can hope so. So you can see in the middle here, see if I get my pointer working. 12th Street is right here. 11th Street is right there. Petticoat Lane. This is where the Woolworths was. So if you go to Kansas City, now you know where to look. By the way, which Kansas City is this? Missouri, right. Which is the better Kansas City? Couple of detractors there. Yes, of course, Kansas. I got it. All right. This is the Muleback Hotel. This was built about 2 years after 12th Street Rag, but it's important to Kansas City because anybody who played in Kansas City, I think James Scott played there a couple times, but Dave Bowman played at the Muleback. Charles Johnson had a long-standing gig there with his orchestras. So the Muleback was built at the corner of 12th and Main, I think it was. So now you know something about that. So next week, on our next episode of the Ragtime Zone, Chanticleer, cock of the walk, or just plain chicken? Is jazz healthy for your children, or is it the devil's food? Blossom Seeley and Sophie Tucker on #MeToo. Think about that one. Me too? Mike Bernard and Flo Ziegfeld on Please, Me? They're all notorious for stuff, so that's why that's funny. Ragtime Rosie, and no, I don't mean Roseanne, plays Carnegie Easter Service. Come on, Ragtime Rosie played the Rosary. Jerome Remick versus Harry Von Tilzer, Smackdown, 2 big publishers. On our next episode of The Ragtime Zone. Any questions?